I pretended to be reconciling with my estranged daughter while secretly recording her confessions about the drugs. The small recording device felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my jacket pocket as I sat across from her in that dimly lit coffee shop downtown. My hands trembled slightly as I stirred my latte, trying to appear calm while my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. She looked so different from the little girl who used to braid my hair and ask me to read bedtime stories twice. Her once bright eyes had become hollow, shadowed by dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and choices I couldn't bear to think about. The purple streaks in her hair caught the afternoon light filtering through the window, and I noticed how thin she'd become, how her clothes hung loose on her frame like they belonged to someone else. 3 years of silence stretched between us like an invisible wall built from harsh words, slammed doors, and broken promises. The last time we'd spoken, she'd screamed at me about how I never understood her, how I was controlling and suffocating, how she wished she'd never been born into this family. Those words had cut deeper than any knife, and I'd carried them with me every single day since. But today was different because I had a plan, even though it made my stomach churn with guilt and desperation. The police had been clear about what they needed to build a case against the people who were destroying my neighborhood, turning kids into hollow shells of themselves. They needed concrete evidence, recordings, confessions, something that would stick in court and put these monsters away for good. My daughter had been involved with them for months now, and I'd watched helplessly as she spiraled further and further into a world I couldn't reach. The phone calls from concerned neighbors, the whispered conversations at the grocery store, the way people looked at me with pity mixed with judgment. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one could prove it. So when she finally agreed to meet me, after I'd sent dozens of desperate text messages begging for just one conversation, I saw my chance. The recording device had been surprisingly easy to get, and the detective had walked me through exactly what they needed to hear. Names, locations, quantities, anything that could help them build their case. She ordered just black coffee, and I watched her thin fingers wrap around the cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we'd never said and everything we'd said too harshly. I cleared my throat and started with the words I'd practiced in my car for an hour before coming inside. The apology came out stilted and rehearsed, but her eyes softened just a little when I told her how much I missed her, how empty the house felt without her laughter echoing through the halls. She shifted in her seat, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the daughter I remembered, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them the most beautiful flowers in the world. We talked about small things at first, safe topics like the weather and how her old room looked exactly the same, waiting for her to come home. But gradually, as the afternoon wore on and the coffee shop emptied around us, the conversation began to drift toward darker territory. She mentioned being tired, really tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Her voice carried a weight that made my chest tighten, and I found myself leaning forward, both as a concerned mother and as someone secretly recording every word she said. The guilt of my deception felt like acid in my throat, but I kept thinking about all the other mothers who might never get their daughters back if I didn't do this. The first real admission came almost by accident, a casual mention of staying up all night helping friends with their problems. She spoke about it like it was normal, like spending entire nights in abandoned buildings and empty houses was just another part of growing up. My fingers involuntarily moved toward the recording device, making sure it was still running, still capturing everything. As she continued talking, the details began to paint a picture that made my blood run cold. She described a world I'd only seen in news reports and police briefings, but hearing it from her lips made it real in a way that terrified me. She talked about the hierarchy, about who was in charge and who followed orders, about the careful systems they'd developed to avoid getting caught. The names started coming then, dropped casually into conversation like they were discussing mutual friends from school. Each name felt like another piece of evidence, another step toward justice, but also another step away from the innocent daughter I'd raised. She mentioned addresses too, places where things happened, places where people went when they needed certain things. I sat there nodding and making sympathetic sounds, while inside I was screaming. This was my baby, my little girl who used to be afraid of the dark and would crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Now she was casually describing a world that would give most people nightmares. And she was doing it with the same tone she used to use when telling me about her day at school. The recording device felt heavier with each passing minute, weighted down by the secrets it was capturing. I kept thinking about the detective's words, about how important this information could be, about how many lives it might save. But I also kept thinking about the betrayal, about how I was violating the trust of the one person in the world I loved more than my own life. She paused to sip her coffee, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. When she looked up at me, there was something different in her eyes, something that made my heart skip a beat. For a moment, I thought she might have figured out what I was doing, that she could somehow sense the recording device burning a hole in my pocket. But instead, she did something that completely shattered my world. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers cold and fragile against mine, and she started to cry. Not the angry, frustrated tears of our last fight, but quiet, desperate tears that spoke of exhaustion and fear, and a loneliness so profound it made my soul ache. She told me she was scared, really scared, and that she didn't know how to get out of the situation she'd gotten herself into. The people she'd been working with weren't just business associates, they were dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. She'd seen things, heard things, that made her realize she was in way over her head. This wasn't the confession I'd expected to record. This wasn't the hardened criminal the police had described. This was my terrified daughter, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape, reaching out to the one person she thought might be able to help her. And here I was, secretly recording every word of her vulnerability, every admission of fear and regret. The weight of what I was doing hit me like a physical blow, and I had to fight to keep my composure. She was trusting me with her deepest fears, her most desperate secrets, and I was planning to hand them over to the authorities. The recording device felt like it was burning through my jacket, branding me as the worst kind of mother, the kind who would betray her own child. But then she said something that changed everything again. She mentioned a specific incident, something that had happened just a week ago, something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about other kids, younger kids, kids who were being hurt in ways that made me want to scream. She described it matter-of-factly, like she was recounting a trip to the grocery store, and I realized that her casual tone wasn't callousness, it was a defense mechanism. She'd seen so much, experienced so much, that she'd had to shut down emotionally just to survive. My little girl had been forced to become someone I didn't recognize, someone who could witness horrible things and keep functioning. The details she shared were exactly what the police needed, but they were also more than I could bear to hear. She talked about the systematic exploitation, about how they targeted vulnerable kids, about how they used fear and dependency to keep people trapped. She mentioned specific locations, specific methods, specific people who were responsible for turning children into commodities. I sat there listening, my heart breaking and my mind racing, trying to process the fact that my daughter was both victim and witness, both trapped and complicit. The recording device captured every word, while I struggled to reconcile the scared girl holding my hand with the person describing such terrible things. As the afternoon faded into evening, she continued talking, and I began to understand that this wasn't just a confession, it was a cry for help. She was giving me all this information because she wanted out, because she was hoping I could somehow use it to save her and others like her. She didn't know about the recording device, but she was telling me everything anyway, trusting me to figure out how to make it stop. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd started this conversation planning to betray her trust, but she was voluntarily giving me exactly what I needed to potentially save her life. She was being honest with me in a way she hadn't been in years, and I was being dishonest with her in a way that made me hate myself. By the time we finally left the coffee shop, the recording device had captured hours of testimony that would probably put dozens of people behind bars. But it had also captured something else, something I hadn't expected. Proof that my daughter was as much a victim as anyone else in this situation, maybe more so because she'd been betrayed by the very people she'd trusted. Walking to our cars in the parking lot, she hugged me for the first time in 3 years, and I felt her thin frame pressed against mine, so fragile and breakable. She thanked me for listening, for not judging her, for still being her mother despite everything that had happened between us. The guilt of my deception felt like it was going to crush me. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the recording device, knowing that its contents could change everything. The information my daughter had shared could potentially save countless lives, could shut down operations that were destroying families and communities. But using it would mean admitting that I'd betrayed her trust at the very moment she'd chosen to trust me again. I thought about all the other mothers who were living my nightmare, wondering where their children were, praying they were safe, hoping against hope that someone would be able to help them. I thought about the younger kids my daughter had mentioned, the ones who were being hurt right now while I sat in my comfortable kitchen debating ethics and morality. The decision I made that night wasn't easy, and it wasn't clean, and it wasn't something I'd ever be able to feel completely good about. But it was the decision of a mother who loved her daughter enough to do whatever it took to save her, even if it meant she might never forgive me. The next morning, I called the detective and arranged to meet him at his office. The recording device felt lighter in my purse than it had in my pocket, but the weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me like a physical force. I kept thinking about my daughter's trust, about the hug in the parking lot, about the way she'd looked at me when she said she was scared. The detective's office was exactly what I'd expected. Institutional furniture, harsh fluorescent lighting, and the smell of old coffee and desperation. He listened to portions of the recording with a professional detachment that made me feel sick, nodding and taking notes like he was reviewing a grocery list rather than listening to my daughter's most vulnerable moments. What I hadn't expected was his reaction when he finished listening. Instead of the satisfaction I'd anticipated, he looked troubled, almost sad. He explained that while the information was incredibly valuable, the circumstances under which it had been obtained were complicated. My daughter wasn't just a witness, she was clearly a victim, and the recording proved that more than anything else. He talked about protective custody, about witness protection, about the possibility of immunity in exchange for her cooperation. But he also talked about the dangers she'd be facing, about how the people she'd described didn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operations. My attempt to save her had potentially put her in more danger than she'd been in before. The next few days passed in a blur of legal consultations and police briefings. I learned more about the criminal justice system than I'd ever wanted to know, and I began to understand that there were no clean solutions to the mess we'd found ourselves in. Every option involved risks, every choice carried the potential for devastating consequences. The hardest part was not being able to call my daughter, not being able to warn her about what was coming. The police had made it clear that any contact from me could compromise their investigation and potentially endanger her life. So I sat in my empty house, staring at my phone, desperate to hear her voice, but knowing that staying silent was the only way to protect her. The arrests began 3 days later, and they were swift and coordinated. The news reports showed footage of multiple locations being raided simultaneously, of dozens of people being led away in handcuffs, of evidence being carried out in boxes and bags. I watched it all on television, knowing that my daughter's words had made it possible, knowing that she was somewhere out there, probably terrified and confused. She called me that night, and her voice was different, harder and more frightened than it had been in the coffee shop. She knew the raids were connected to our conversation, knew that somehow the information she'd shared with me had ended up in the hands of law enforcement. She didn't ask directly if I'd betrayed her trust, but the hurt in her voice was unmistakable. I couldn't lie to her anymore, couldn't pretend that I was innocent in all of this. So I told her the truth about the recording device, about my meeting with the detective, about my desperate attempt to save her from a situation that was destroying her. I told her that I loved her more than my own life, and that I'd done what I thought was necessary to protect her. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and she said something that I'll never forget. She said that she'd known, somehow, that I was recording our conversation, that she'd felt it in her gut from the moment we sat down together. But she'd told me everything anyway, because she was hoping I'd be brave enough to use it. She'd been trying to find a way out for months, but she'd been too scared and too trapped to do it alone. Our conversation had been her way of putting the tools in my hands, of making sure that someone she trusted would have the information needed to bring down the people who were destroying so many lives. She'd been counting on me to betray her trust, because she knew it was the only way she'd ever be free. The revelation that she'd been manipulating me just as much as I'd been manipulating her should have made me angry. But instead, it filled me with a strange kind of pride. My daughter had found a way to save herself and others, using me as an unwitting accomplice in her own rescue. She'd trusted me to do the right thing, even when the right thing felt like the worst kind of betrayal. The trials that followed were long and complicated, with my daughter serving as a key witness for the prosecution. She testified about things that no young person should ever have to experience, but she did it with a strength and clarity that amazed everyone in the courtroom. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, to paint her as a willing participant rather than a victim, but the recording of our conversation provided context that made her trauma undeniable. Watching her on the witness stand, I realized that somewhere in the darkness of the previous few years, my little girl had become a woman. Not in the way any parent hopes their child will grow up, but in the way that people grow when they're forced to survive things that would break most adults. She'd found strength in places I didn't even know existed, and she'd used that strength to help ensure that the people who had hurt her and so many others would face consequences. The verdicts, when they finally came, were mostly what we'd hoped for. The major players received lengthy prison sentences, and the operations that had been terrorizing our community were effectively shut down. But the victory felt hollow because the cost had been so high, and because no amount of justice could undo the damage that had been done. My daughter and I didn't immediately return to the relationship we'd had before everything went wrong. Too much had happened, too many lines had been crossed, too many truths had been revealed. But we began the slow process of rebuilding trust, of learning to be honest with each other in ways we'd never been before. She moved back home a few months after the trials ended, and we began the careful work of healing. Some days were better than others, and some conversations were harder than we'd expected. But we were both committed to creating something new from the wreckage of what we'd lost, something stronger and more honest than what we'd had before. The recording device sits in a drawer in my kitchen now, a reminder of one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, if there might have been another way to save her without betraying her trust. But then I think about all the other families who were spared because of the information she shared, and I know that some choices don't have clean answers. My daughter is doing better now, though she still has nightmares sometimes, and there are days when the weight of what she experienced seems almost too much to bear. But she's also discovered a strength she didn't know she had, and she's using that strength to help other kids who are facing similar situations. She speaks at schools sometimes, sharing her story in the hope that it might prevent other young people from making the same mistakes she did. The house feels different now, filled with a different kind of energy than it had when she was growing up. We're both different people than we were before, shaped by experiences that changed us in fundamental ways. But we're also more honest with each other, more willing to have difficult conversations, more committed to protecting the relationship we've rebuilt. I still think about that afternoon in the coffee shop, about the weight of the recording device in my pocket, about the moment when I realized that sometimes loving someone means being willing to hurt them in order to save them. It's a lesson I never wanted to learn, but one that has shaped every decision I've made since. The neighborhood is quieter now, safer in ways that are hard to quantify but easy to feel. Kids play outside again, parents don't lock their doors quite as tightly, and the constant undercurrent of fear that had permeated everything for so long has finally begun to fade. The price of that safety was higher than anyone should have to pay, but it was a price we were willing to pay to protect the people we loved. Looking back, I realized that the recording device was never really about gathering evidence or building a case. It was about a mother's willingness to do whatever it took to save her daughter, even if it meant sacrificing her own sense of moral certainty. It was about a daughter's courage in finding a way to save herself and others, even when the path required manipulating the person she loved most. We're still figuring out how to live with the choices we made, how to balance the good that came from our actions with the pain they caused. But we're figuring it out together, and that makes all the difference. The recording device captured more than just confessions and evidence. It captured the beginning of our journey back to each other, messy and complicated and imperfect as it was. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we never plan to have. And sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones that feel like betrayal. I learned that truth in a coffee shop on a quiet afternoon, while a small recording device captured the words that would change everything. And I'm still learning it every day, as my daughter and I continue to build something new from the pieces of what we almost lost.